Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. Richmond, we have a problem. Alternative title, Vacuums in Virginia. And or Caracas on the James, where racism is crashing and burning into Me Too, a culture of privilege and a full-on existential crisis for the Democratic Party. In this critical swing state, just as candidates declare for the 2020 presidential election. Stay with us. Full disclosure is made possible by Evo Advisors, helping busy professionals who have more than a 401k plan to worry about. Evo Advisors, offering clients financial advice, fiduciaries for families at evoadvisors.com. And by Performance Food Service, a proud partner of Virginia restaurants and food service establishments, with more than 13,000 associates in 75 locations nationwide, online at pfgc.com. Joining me in studio in a downtown RVA, my guest tonight, Samantha Willis, a writer. You've seen her work in Essence, Glamour, the Virginia Mercury, Richmond Magazine, and her groundbreaking work on the Unmasking series, a community learning experience on race and racism. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing this evening?
Thank you.
Great.
And Professor Judi Crenshaw. She's at VCU's Robertson School of Media and Culture. Repeat guest. Thank you for joining us.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
And hopefully rolling in halfway through will be Jeff Schapiro, the politics guru at the Times-Dispatch. He's had his hands full, and he's literally trying to break away from deadline, just steps from the Capitol as this story keeps morphing. So in the interest of full disclosure, I should tell you, everybody out there, that we are here Wednesday night recording this. By the time you hear this on the radio, our local dog catcher might well be governor at this point. You're looking for the line of succession.
That might be a good thing, Robin.
And another piece of full disclosure in a more sober sense is the accuser of our lieutenant governor, Justin Fairfax, who's accusing him of sexual assault, is actually a friend and acquaintance of mine from college. Vanessa Tyson, I believe, we're Facebook friends. I bumped into her at our 20th reunion in May. I don't really keep up with her. I just feel like I should put that out there. And in the way of introduction, just to timestamp this for everybody out there, and I'm sorry if this is long-winded, this is the byline from Chris Cillizza on Wednesday afternoon, February 6, 2019, on CNN Politics, the complete and utter collapse of Virginia's Democratic Party. Let me read a little bit for you. In the last 6 days, he writes, the following things have happened. Governor Ralph Northam said he was in a picture in his med school yearbook of two people, one in blackface, the other in KKK robes. He then recanted and said he wasn't in that picture, but he added that he had darkened his face to look more like Michael Jackson for a dance contest in 1984. Bullet 2. A woman named Vanessa Tyson accused Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax of assaulting her during the 2004 Democratic National Convention in Boston. Fairfax angrily denied the allegations. Then on Wednesday, Tyson released a statement in which she said in part what began as consensual kissing quickly turned into a sexual assault. Bullet 3. State Attorney General Mark Herring, in a statement released Wednesday morning, acknowledged that he too had appeared in blackface at a party. In 1980, when I was a 19-year-old undergraduate in college, he wrote, some friends suggested we attend a party dressed like rappers we listened to at the time, like Curtis Blow, and perform a song. Close quote. And here's what Chris Cillizza wrote. What the actual hell? And I punt that to you, Samantha Willis.
I would echo those words, WTH for sure. The first thing that I will say is I'm encouraged to see so many media outlets referring to these incidents for what they are. Wearing blackface is a racist action. That's not to say that the person who's donning blackface is a racist, but the mere act is a racist action based on a racist tradition that has a particularly long history in Virginia and in Richmond. At the root of this is race and racism, just like so many elements of Virginia's society, so many elements of the things that make us who we are, the state that we are. One thing that's really interesting to me concerning the blackface, and I wrote about this in 2016, it was the thick of the presidential election time. It was almost right before President Donald Trump was elected president. It was a very contentious time in the nation, and also here in the city. We had a popular music promoter don blackface at a Halloween party, and this sent shockwaves through the city for two different reasons. Half of the people couldn't understand why it was a big deal. The other half of the people were completely outraged. And one thing that I found is that people really didn't understand the history of blackface, that it dates back to a tradition of minstrel shows that were degrading, dehumanizing performances, mocking African Americans and formerly enslaved people. In particular here in Richmond, I want people to understand, as this is unfolding with Governor Northam, as this is unfolding with, Attorney General Herring, and related to these blackface allegations and situations, I should say, here in Richmond, we have a native, Mr. Freeman Gosden. And Freeman Gosden, if you don't know, he was one half of the seminal radio program Amos and Andy, which was just a runaway success in the 1930s and 1940s. It was two white men, and they used blackface to promote their show. Gosden, being a native of Richmond, Virginia, was most likely imitating black people that he'd seen growing up here. Their voices, their demeanor, their everything about them, putting on the persona like a costume and then taking it off again. In essence, that's the whole problem with blackface. You turn people's identities into a caricature. And then you also have another Richmonder, Charles Sidney Gilpin, who is actually the namesake of one of our public housing communities here. He was a groundbreaking African-American actor who found success even on Broadway. He made the decision to stop performing in blackface after a certain point, and his career tanked after that. So you have this dichotomy of a white man using blackface and it leading to runaway success with his career, and then a black man, his decision to not use blackface or wear blackface, leading to the complete detriment of his career. So this dichotomy of black people being on the receiving end of the negative effects of blackface and that particular type of racism.
Let me ask this and get it out of the way.
Sure.
Is blackface beyond parody? So if you be twice removed from the actual hurt event, let's say in the Jim Crow era or during radical reconstruction of connections to minstrel shows and everything, but kind of spoofing that very effort. No, it's just in your writing, actually, when that concert promoter here dressed ironically in blackface, you came out and said there's just no occasion to apologize for that. And I thought of you again when Megyn Kelly's career was felled a couple of months ago at the Today Show when she tried to apologize for blackface.
And I said on Twitter not long ago, I think I said on Twitter around that time that Megyn Kelly made those comments that I'm just so sick of blackface, sick of hearing about it, sick of hearing white people wearing it, sick of the latest incident of white people defending it. And every time I feel that someone makes light of blackface or they make it seem like, in the situation here in Richmond with that music promoter, it was, the comments were, it's just a Halloween costume. This isn't hurting anybody. This is, get over it. If you're that butthurt over a costume, then you have more serious problems to deal with. And then other people just claim complete ignorance about, the history of it and why it's so degrading and why it's so abrasive. And I mean, every time that the history and blackface is made to be not a big deal, to me as an African American, that it's a slap in the face. It's just like, this racism and this history of racism doesn't really matter. It's not that big of a deal. Let's put that to the side. Let's not focus on that, and let's look at other facets of this.
Professor Crenshaw, what's your take?
Well, I think about the communication pieces of it in that it's just really frustrating and really just sad and unjust to hear that anybody would think that it's not a big deal. I mean, to my mind, it's always been a big deal. And on top of that, there's the systemic piece that African Americans have always been denied the communication tools to complain about it. They've been cut off from having any input into this hurt and even trying to inform the dominant culture how hurtful it was. And so I think there's just double shame in that. Of course, the dominant culture can say it's no big deal because they had complete control over all of the communication channels and cut African Americans out of that process. So it's just completely unjust from the get-go. So I can sit here and say it's always been wrong. I think it's always been clearly wrong. I don't think there's ever been any confusion about that. But the dominant culture of white people have always been kind of allowed to minimize it or say whatever they wanted about it because there wasn't any meaningful way for a Black culture to express their hurt over it or make that history known.
And Judi, if I could just jump in and say one thing that I've seen in the recent reports about this situation with Governor Northam and now even Attorney General Herring, I asked my Black friend, my one Black friend, if this would be offensive. Or I asked my Black friend if this would, offend them. And they said no. It is completely unfair and insincere to ask the closest Black person, the closest African American to you, to vouch for you in terms of excusing your racism in the form of wearing blackface. And I think it further just exacerbates the divide that we see in terms of racism here in Richmond, certainly, but really across the nation right now. And I just think that it's incredibly unfair that we keep returning to this same thing of, I asked the closest Black person to me. They didn't seem to have a problem with it. Black people aren't monolithic. What may offend me as an African American may not have an impact on the next person or even an African American in my family. That doesn't mean that you're free to commit traditionally historic and acts of racism. It's just inexcusable. And to use Black people, to try to use your Black friends to excuse your racism, I think is incredibly just disingenuous and dishonorable.
I think in Northam's case at his disastrous press conference, he was explaining that it actually took his Black friend just a year ago to even explain to him why this was hurtful. Number one, that's not a communication channel. I mean, it's not a person of color's responsibility. It's not their job to explain to anybody or represent, a whole race of people why this is wrong. It's up to a person in power, and we haven't gotten to that yet. But when someone wants to run for office and when someone takes on this responsibility of representing all the people is an extremely diverse group of folks. And it's their responsibility to learn, to read, to be humble, to start from a place of not assuming that they are entitled to anything, not assuming that they have options, not even assuming in Northern's case that he has control over how this thing ends.
Let me ask you, Samantha, I mean, if you were to take completely his explanation in this and he'd never bought his grad school yearbook, which I didn't buy my graduate school yearbook, and that he was kind of miffed at this and everything, is there in your mind any way that if he literally found out about this in a blindsiding way a week ago that he could have come out and preemptively apologized and cast it aside and said, that is not me. Who I am is my record. Who I am is everybody I fought for, Medicare for all, the support that I have in the African-American community? Or was he immediately banished to a kind of a leper colony for having had that in his historical body of work?
I don't think that there was, immediate banishment. I think that if he somehow did not know that this image was in the yearbook, which is, for me, it's hard to believe. But if he somehow didn't know or realize that it was there, I think the first approach that he took, a sincere apology, a sincere, I made this mistake, I did this, I didn't know that, that this was represented in this way in this yearbook, forgive me. If he'd stuck, I think, with that, I think things would be very different now. And I will say, quite honestly, for me and for, people, a lot of people in my community that I've been talking with about this, the act of him, of Governor Northam and even of other elected officials, the revelations that they may have done something racist in the past, such as wear blackface or, other people have used the N-word publicly, et cetera, et cetera. The act itself is not so much the problem if there is contrition, if there's realization and growth from that time period. And you can say, I'm a different person. Look at my record. Look at what I've done since then. Look at how I've changed. The problem for me, specifically with our governor's situation, is that there's this doubling down now. There's this, no, I refuse to accept this, and I'm going to hold the state basically my constituents hostage because I want to hold on to my position versus doing what's best for the Commonwealth. That speaks to a person's character. And that's the issue for me. Everybody makes mistakes in the past, and I'm really curious to hear Judi's perspective on our social media culture, of kind of the gotcha, look what we've dug in your past tweets and found. So everybody's made mistakes in the past. The mistake itself, it was not the crux of the issue. It was how it was handled. It was the complete 180 and the doubling down, which is something you often see people doing when they've been caught in making these types of racist
Let me get a chance to make a quip. I find it interesting that Richmond and Caracas are effectively sister cities this week because everybody's calling for Nicolas Maduro's head in Venezuela. He's lost all the support except for maybe China and Russia. And everybody in the Democratic Party, at least, and certainly the Republican Party, is calling for Ralph Northam's head. He's lost Hillary Clinton. He's lost Joe Biden, AOC, anybody of any significance. And I think Justin Fairfax, to remain magnanimous and seemingly out of the fold until the whole situation got toxic again, stayed out of it. So he's certainly a mortally wounded animal, and people were waiting for it. But this starts to get much more complex and ugly and dirty when we get to the levels of Justin Fairfax and then Mark Herring and then succession to the Republican Speaker of the House. But before we get there, Samantha and Judi, and I will throw this up at a jump ball, I understand that blackface and the N-word are certainly tripwires, and not tripwires, but third rails that you're not absolutely non-negotiably allowed to touch. There's no way around it. There's no artistic license, or there's no, I didn't mean it, or I meant it ironically. But then we start to get on slipperier and slipperier areas. You saw now the governor of Florida, DeSantis, during the election, he came out and called out his opponent, Andrew Gillum, and he said, let's not get into the gutter and don't monkey up this election by electing my opponent who is African-American. Like, I don't understand who uses monkey up as a verb. I don't understand how that's not like a glaring, blowing, ear-piercing dog whistle, but he's governor of Florida right now, right? We've had many other microaggressions happen. George Allen clearly lost re-election when he came up with the macaca quip, which was a little cryptic, and you needed to do a three-point turn to realize what it meant. But Samantha, I drove here tonight to the studio on Monument Avenue and passed by all these Confederate generals, including and especially Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, and Justin Fairfax, the African-American lieutenant governor, just a week before this Black History Month, stepped up and walked away from the Senate that he oversees because they were honoring and extolling Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. I'd like to read from an article by Adam Serwer in The Atlantic, which I keep quoting, The Myth of the Kindly General Lee. Robert E. Lee's cruelty as a slave master was not confined to physical punishment. The historian Elizabeth Brown Pryor's portrait of Lee through his writings, she writes that Lee ruptured the Washington and Custis tradition of respecting slave families by hiring them off to other plantations, and that by 1860 he had broken up every family but one on the estate, some of whom had been together since the Mount Vernon days. The separation of slave families was one of the most unfathomably devastating aspects of slavery, and Pryor wrote that Lee's slaves regarded him as, quote, the worst man I ever see. He goes on to write that when two of his slaves escaped and were recaptured, Lee either beat them himself and ordered the overseer to, quote, lay it on well. Wesley Norris, one of the slaves who was whipped, recalled that, quote, not satisfied with simply lacerating our naked flesh, General Lee then ordered the overseer to thoroughly wash our backs with brine, which was done, close quote. Let's repeat this again for everybody outside of Virginia and the rest of the country. This is 150 plus years removed from the end of the Civil War and more, than the Emancipation Proclamation. Robert E. Lee is still a revered figure here. All that revisionism on Monument Avenue for Confederate generals. How is that not directly an assault on the African Americans of the Commonwealth?
It is. Who says that it's not?
Well, everybody on Monument Avenue says don't touch our monuments.
Everybody on Monument Avenue. First of all, I don't know that it's everybody on Monument Avenue, but I would say a good number of white people on Monument Avenue say don't touch our monuments. Richmond is half African American, and many African Americans here have made plain time and again, these monuments do not represent the Virginia and the Richmond that we want to be. It represents Richmond of its capital of the Confederacy days, of the days when Black people were less than equals in every facet of society, of public life, and did not have equal opportunity to take part in our society. That's what they represent. The people that put them there were hoping to continue that mindset that would lead to a loss of opportunities for African Americans, really anybody who wasn't a white person. I think that it is a very abhorrent and very disturbing sight to see those monuments still standing, to see people revere them and the men that they represent, knowing our city's history and knowing, we've kind of got this weird split in Richmond. We're Richmond, but we're also RVA. We're a city that's, making all these magazine lists for, best places for millennials to move. We've got a booming art scene. Restaurants are just off the chain. And it's all excellent and it's good and it's progressive and it's beautiful and it's shiny. But we have this really ugly history that many of us do not want to deal with. We don't want to look at it. It only rears its head, or it begins to rear its head through issues like Monument Avenue.
You remember in 2015, the white supremacist terrorist Dylann Roof walked into the Charleston church, the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. It had history going back more than 200 years and proceeded in very cold blood to murder 9 African Americans, including the senior pastor and a state senator, during a prayer service. In order to incite a race war. And that, I believe, in the Malcolm Gladwellian sense, would have been the tipping point for the Confederate flag. That's when you started to see people come out and say that actually that flag is now verboten. It's no longer one of these things that you could fly up there for Southern heritage and the valor and everything else like that. And then we started to see monuments really questioned. It's not very linear, but then a lot of that led to Charlottesville. A lot of that led to the incident at UNC, places like New Orleans questioning their monuments. I'm amazed, though, here in Central Virginia, where, after all, everybody talks about how blue the state has become and its senators and the governors, that Monument Avenue is still largely untouched in that sense, that there aren't people erupting in anger, that we are now in 2019. The Civil War ended in 1865. The Confederacy, you can't be a Confederate apologist.
I think there are people erupting in anger about it, but I also think there are very many people who don't want those monuments to go anywhere.
I'm sorry, I'm going to push back at you. It was hardly in the news that Justin Fairfax had to walk away from an apology session honoring General Lee. It's not a taboo thing to honor General Lee and Stonewall Jackson.
No, not at all. There's a shrine.
That was hardly in the news. He Instagrammed it. He tweeted it before any of this imbroglio.
Sure.
And I'm bringing it up after 3 separate crises, 2-3 weeks later.
Well, I think Samantha hit on it. There's just 2 very separate Richmonds, and I think that there has not been the leadership in Richmond like there was in New Orleans.
But stop with Richmond. That's the Virginia State Senate that he was overseeing. Right? It wasn't just Richmond. He, as president of the Virginia Senate, when he stepped away, the Republican-controlled, barely by like a hair, comes in and says, we are going to honor this tradition of extolling Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. And he, as an African-American statewide elected official, walked away from that. And it hardly made the news.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying in terms of the monuments, I don't think that there's been the leadership and the commitment to make it happen, to have any movement there. And a committed, like a long-term commitment of leadership like there was in New Orleans and has been for 20 years. That wasn't an overnight thing of...
That's important to know.
Yeah, I mean, there was people on the ground for 20 years fighting to take those things down. So anyway, I just think there's a quiet old Richmond that runs the financial district here and has all the power. They still hold sort of a core power that just basically remain kind of quiet. And they pull some strings and keep things going and still believe in an old Richmond. And they essentially maybe don't want to cause too many waves. They're glad the city is growing in the way that Samantha described. They are very glad that there's great restaurants and millennials moving in. But they also are very hardline conservative people that don't want the monuments going anywhere.
Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. You are listening to Judi Crenshaw. She is a professor at VCU's Robertson School of Media and Culture, and we're joined also by Samantha Willis, a writer. You've seen her bylines in Essence, Glamour, Richmond Magazine. She was behind the groundbreaking Unmasking series on race and racism. Unpack this further for me here, because there's a part of us that just wants to talk about the RVA. But as you know, Virginia and covering Virginia is a very different beast right now. If I take you to Northern Virginia, it's dark blue and it's pitch blue. And here in Central Virginia, we just elected our first Democratic congressperson in the RVA, the Virginia 7th, and Abigail Spanberger. I think the first Democrat elected to serve since 1971, and certainly the first woman. And then you go down to Southern Virginia. If I drive down to Farmville, if I drive through Powhatan, Chester, all that stuff passed. If you go to Bristol, as I said, it resembles much more of Dixie. So, and here you have a statewide elected official who was very popular among the multi-hued Democrats involved, not just the hipster millennials moving in the beer district and the donuts, but Indian Americans in Northern Virginia, the swaths of like Little Hanoi on Horsepen that we have here, the Vietnamese Americans. And this throws that all into question. Just an incident that comes back to haunt him from 35 years ago.
Well, I mean, again, I think it's about accountability, and I think it's about how you process the situation moving forward. Again, it's not about, we call something on Twitter cancel culture. It's not about just condemning someone forever for an action that they did 35 years ago. It's about, has this individual matured, learned, grown as a person? How have they demonstrated that? And are they capable of leading in the capacity, in such an important capacity? My response to that would be no, based on the immediate recant and the doubling down that we've seen. I think that marked a turning point in which he lost a lot of respect amongst. For me as an African American, I lost a lot of respect, because if he'd done the blackface incident, he'd learned from it, he'd grown from it, we can move forward. I mean, after all, African Americans and black people in Virginia, we have to do a lot of forgiving and turning the other cheek to move forward if we want to have any progress in the state. So that's not a foreign concept. The problem was his recanting, and now the doubling down, the ferocious denial, and the being willing to hold the state in a bad position to hang on to his position.
What do you think about the second shoe to drop? Actually, the second and a half shoe to drop, if you count Michael Jackson, that second explanation, which was beyond surreal, but then the Justin Fairfax element of it, where initially people weren't all that bothered by it because you had the possibility that Justin Fairfax could inherit the 3 years left on Northam, a young, attractive candidate, and then run for his own 4 years. Mm-hmm. And so the Democratic Party very quickly, some of the leading lights, especially going into the 2020 election where they want to come to town and not deal with an albatross, backed Justin Fairfax and said they should step down. But then this allegation happened where Me Too effectively crashed into racism.
It did. And I think this is a good examination of intersectionality, meaning how these social issues, race, I think that there's also a little bit of toxic masculinity going on with the situation concerning our lieutenant governor. The response, the tone of the response that he gave to the statement was not necessarily a tone that I would expect from an elected official that I was comfortable with. The later revelations by the Washington Post that his camp had exaggerated, their statement that the Washington Post had thoroughly investigated and found no basis for the story, that was not true. All of these things definitely rained on the parade for Lieutenant Governor Fairfax. But I think that, again, this is a good example of how we cannot continue to look at issues in silos. It can't just be about race. It can't just be about economics. It can't just be about gender studies. It can't just be about any one thing. All of these things are very much interconnected and in some ways interdependent on each other. And that's what you see in this situation with Lieutenant Governor Fairfax. I am very hopeful that a full investigation, a fair investigation of that situation will occur, and that the truth will be known, and that my heart and my thoughts go out to the woman who has come forward with these allegations, because it cannot be easy to have done that. And I think I'm not amongst a small number of people wondering why would someone come forward with these allegations if there was no truth to them. What does she have to gain by making up a complete falsehood? But again, this is an example of how these issues connect and collide.
And then pow, 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 Mark Herring, who would be next in line, the Attorney General, comes out and says, oh, I was involved preemptively. Like, this is where if you do a social media audit, which I think a lot of your students are asking you about in the PR program and in social media, and then that would leave, and we'll talk to Jeff Schapiro, who's here from the Times-Dispatch, that would then leave the Republican Speaker of the House. I mean, at some point, does it, as I joked before, does it hit up against dog catcher or second selectman or freeholder?
What my students talked about today, what I urged them to look for was people in power centering themselves, and how this was messaged in their statements, how this was messaged by their PR people on social media and in their official statements. And it seems like, that's maybe just to piggyback on what Samantha was saying, which I hardly agree with everything that she just said. And I think to just maybe add another piece to it, to the intersectionality piece, is that when leader, and maybe particularly a male leader, is in power, they have to, be sure that they're not centering themselves in this reaction. And that's what was so disastrous about that second press conference. So whether or not, it's actually him in the picture is irrelevant, because his true nature came out in that second press conference when he doubled down, as Samantha said, and was making it very plain that he was now thinking only about himself, not the greater good of his constituents, not the greater good of how Virginia was going to move forward, but how could he, save his own pride? How could he get out of this the most cleanly and in a way that he wanted to? And PR-wise, this is not the most important point for the highest elected leader in the state of Virginia. He should have people around him advising him that is not the center of the conversation right now. It is not you. It is not about you anymore. You are not allowed to have it be about you anymore. And I think that perhaps in the Fairfax situation, that sort of took control as well. When someone allows anger to overtake their response and not, realize that it's not about you, that perhaps it is about, the situation a young woman is in, or then it goes awry. And actually, in terms of Mark Herring, yes, he came out ahead of it. But if you actually read his response, it's the only response that is less centered on him as an individual.
Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. We are talking about the vacuum in Virginia. Richmond, we have a problem. However you want to label this this snowballing disaster. And to that end, joining us in studio, he just got out of the newsroom, is Jeff Schapiro. He's a political reporter and columnist, of course, for the Richmond Times-Dispatch. He's covered Virginia's capital and campaigns for nearly 3 decades, and you can hear him Fridays on our home station, WCVE, during Morning Edition. How are you, sir?
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. And of course, in studio with me is Judi Crenshaw, professor at VCU's Robertson School of Media and Culture, and Samantha Willis. You've seen her byline everywhere, including Essence, Glamour, Richmond Magazine. I just throw it to you open-endedly. Have you ever seen a crisis like this where it's a 1, 2, 3 punch, and the Democratic Party, which was flying high just a week ago, was completely eviscerated in the governor's mansion?
A trifecta in the worst sense of the word. I've certainly never seen anything like this before, and I doubt if really anyone has. The accelerant in all of this, of course, is social media and nonstop news. If one were to venture down to Capitol Square, one would see a grassy knoll, if you will, just covered with reporters, television camera people, folks looking for something fresh, some new angle, something incremental, something with which to advance the story, something with which to keep it at full boil.
Will you tell us at what point it leads to the dog catcher assuming office? I mean, if this effectively fells Northam, and Fairfax and Herring. Who's next in line? Is it the Speaker of the House, the Republican Party?
It would be the Speaker of the House, a Republican, Kirk Cox. And of course, if he were not available, it would then fall to the House itself, a Republican body, to elect a governor, and it could select anyone who met the qualifications to hold the governorship in Virginia. That is, he or she would be.
At what point does it become like the CEO of King's Dominion is called?
Well, that would be the choice of the House of Delegates if it got that far. I don't think it will. This is this situation seems to me a bit overheated, a bit overwrought. It makes for wonderful copy, but the political landscape at this point is so fractured. Maybe a better image might be think of squirrels stuck out on the limbs of trees. How is it possible, particularly for the Democrats as the ascendant party here, to kind of bring everybody back off of these limbs and begin to kind of cool off and move ahead?
You know, there was an observation that was made in The Economist magazine. It was on Byline, I think, a couple of years ago. And what's very peculiar about Richmond, Virginia, even if there's an African-American mayor, it's historically been the case, I think, for 10, 20 years that African-Americans control political life here, while the whites and old money control economic life.
And that is something that is really at the heart of tensions in the Richmond area. I think it's important to point out, though, is that Richmond remains a majority-minority city, even though African Americans are no longer in the majority. It's this multi-hued city that is majority-minority. It is Asians and Latinos that keep Richmond majority-minority. And that's made for a very different vibe in town. And I think people are certainly aware of it. It manifests itself, as I think you put it somewhat cleverly, with a beer district and a donut district. There's a huge generational shift.
I've had better Korean barbecue in Richmond than I've had in New York or L.A. That's absolutely true. I got to be careful to not violate FCC, touting restrictions and everything. But I just want to share that. We have a Hanoi on Horsepen. We have a little Bosnia here. I'm like the George Clooney of the Persian community.
This is not isolated to Richmond. One should look at Virginia.
Sure.
It's the 11th largest state. It is a state whose population, the majority of its residents, are not from here. It is also a richly diverse state in terms of demographics, and that's a relatively fresh addition. When I moved to Richmond in 1979, Virginians, for the most part, were white or African American, a smattering of Native Americans. However, now we have, and they have just sort of emerged almost overnight, a robust and growing Asian community and a robust and growing Hispanic community. And this has, all of this has made for a much more national environment. This is not your father's or grandfather's Virginia.
So how did the state's changing demographics really impact the Governor Northam's ability to lead going forward? If he's to stay in this position as he so strongly wishes, obviously, recognizing this incredible cross-section of nationalities, of different types of people that live here, how effectively might he be able to govern with this recent scandal?
Well, I would note that the paradox of the Northam governorship is that he is a man of the countryside. He is a product of the rural Eastern Shore. He's the first Eastern Shoresman elected governor of Virginia since 1855.
Wow.
But one of the things that he has working in his favor is this strengthening Democratic reflex. To give you an idea just how intense it is and how concentrated it is, a Virginia Democratic statewide candidate only has to carry roughly 10 localities, urban, suburban localities, to win comfortably and put the governorship, the lieutenant governorship, the attorney general's office, and 2 U.S. Senate seats out of reach of Republicans. That's the case right now. The other thing about
But that's getting elected. That's not necessarily leading.
I know. I understand where we're going with this, and this is where we have this tension in our capital between a Republican vote that is largely concentrated in the countryside, very conservative, and very much a reflection of what one sees nationally, and this Democratic vote that's concentrated in metropolitan Virginia and is, for the most part, very liberal. What has happened is redistricting, the artful manner in which legislative boundaries have been drawn by the Republican majority, have provided essentially an artificial majority.
Jeff, you did write very provocatively in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, Virginia Democrats' crisis is becoming a suicide pact. Open that up for me.
Well, there is something about a state, in this case Virginia, that had a two-party competitive tradition, but is now one in which a single party is dominant. And rather than have huge differences over the great issues of the day, most of the figures within the Democratic Party in this instance, their differences may tend to be more of style, more of personality. Their followers then are essentially little camps, and there are slights, perceived and actual, among them. And I think they tend to make for, if you will, a much more vicious brand of politics as a consequence. Since they're not talking about the issues of the idea of the day, they seem to be talking more about individuals.
I've got a question, and this will kind of take it in a different direction. Virginia is not a state that is a stranger to gubernatorial scandals. Okay, we've had our former governor McDonnell. We know what we've been through there just in recent years. How much more of a circus is this situation with our current governor than the scandal with our former governor McDonnell? And in what ways are they different? In what ways are these situations similar?
Well, most obviously, the difference is Bob McDonnell had a legal problem.
Yes.
He was charged with criminal violations for which he was convicted, but of course the conviction was overturned by the Supreme Court. The problem that Ralph Northam has, and to some degree Mark Herring, less so with Justin Fairfax, because his public relations problem, his political problem, is also a legal one, is that Herring, actually, we'll say these three amigos now stand accused, if you will, in the court of public opinion. And that, I think, cuts to their capacity to govern. I wonder if perhaps all of these demands for resignations are a bit hasty, that they are driven by this nonstop news cycle, by this supercharged thing we call social media. And now there seem to be, if you will, sort of mitigating circumstances, not the least of which is Democrats are terrified they might have to relinquish control of the executive branch to Republicans, that the Democrats are trying to figure out some way to sort of turn down the temperature, get back together, move forward.
Jeff, I have to ask you, the difference between the Democratic Party nationally and the Republican Party. The Republican Party doesn't seem willing to throw bodies into the pyre like the Democrats are. I mean, you saw the issue with DeSantis and the awful rhetoric during the election there vis-a-vis Andrew Gillum. You saw the tolerance of Steve King's rhetoric and apologizing on behalf of white supremacy for the longest time. For Me Too, you saw Al Franken snuffed out by a lot of people, including Kirsten Gillibrand, and the party didn't prevaricate on this for the longest time. The Republican Party seems to have much more of a tolerance to keep around at least coded aggression, and might not be quick to judge a person like, Justin Fairfax. You saw how ultimately the party did unify around Brett Kavanaugh. And did we report today that Justin Fairfax has hired Brett Kavanaugh's defense attorney?
Yes, and his accuser is represented by Professor Ford's firm. So the parallels are certainly unnerving. But I think we need to keep something in mind here. What is unfolding in Richmond is very much a consequence of the Democrats' deliberate decision to adopt a zero-tolerance policy on matters of gender and race. And that is a political calculation. The idea here clearly is to maintain as sharp a distinction with the Trump-era Republican Party, where perceived bigotry and misogynist behavior apparently is okay. The Democrats are looking at a make-or-break legislative election in Virginia this fall. They want to win. They not only want to take back the legislature of Virginia, they want to enjoy the full control of Virginia's government for the first time since 1993. They don't want to do anything to disrupt, to threaten those chances, and that means being very mindful of some of the most important elements of the Democratic coalition. That includes minority voters, that includes women, in particular suburban women, affluent, well-educated suburban women.
What is the locus of control for that nationally? Who's calling those shots, or who's setting that standard of kashrut, if you will?
Well, just look at the turnouts in the turnout patterns and the voting returns in the last presidential election. That's one of the things about politics. Politicians, in planning to fight a new campaign, are always using the rules or what seemed to work in the old campaigns. So this is very much what's going on in Virginia, again, an increasingly national state, logically follows what's unfolding at the national level. Look at that gubernatorial election in 2017. It was a mini referendum on what was going on in Washington. The Virginia gubernatorial election has always been viewed that way. There was a significant uptick in turnout that made not just for a Ralph Northam win, but a Ralph Northam landslide and a 15-seat pickup in the House of Delegates. People were out there voting not just for Ralph Northam and Democrats, but against Donald Trump and Republicans. The events associated with Trump administration policies, for example, the attempted Muslim ban, these policies have an immediate implication in a new, diverse, multi-hued state like Virginia.
But I got to jump in here a little bit. I'm sitting here just biting my tongue because I think the events of the last several days, especially for my students, especially for my adult children, they are watching these three the highest Democratic office holders in Virginia take a page directly out of Trump's playbook in the doubling down and saying, I'm going to brazen these accusations out until they just go away. And that is exactly why you have a split in the Democratic Party and a certain demographic and a certain group of people who are very disheartened by all this attention to the Democratic hierarchy and the machinery and saying, we're not putting up with that. We find that disingenuous. And we would rather see someone, walk the walk, talk the talk, do the right thing, and not pay attention to some election down the road and the numbers game.
And I think in particular, to piggyback off of that, when we're talking about increasingly diverse demographics here in the state, for many years, it's been presumed that African Americans would vote Democratic. And there are still these presumptions floating around. And the problem comes in when you have a situation like this with Governor Northam and Fairfax and Herring, in that their label as Democrats don't match with the values of these black voters, of minority voters. How do these things coalesce? How do we move forward from
Well, actually, I would contest that. And while the optics on what is occurring over in Richmond as we speak by no means is favorable to the Democrats. I think if one, looks closely, and one doesn't have to look that closely to see that there is much in the public records of Ralph Northam and Mark Herring that suggest an avid support of minority aspirations. And some very dramatic shifts, interestingly enough. When Mark Herring was a state senator from northern Virginia, Loudoun County, one of the fastest growing localities in the country, also one of the wealthiest, he was for the constitutional amendment that prohibited same-sex marriage in Virginia. Of course, it would be overturned, but as a candidate for Attorney General in 2013, in a Democratic primary, recognizing these changes within Virginia, he essentially swore off his hostility to gay marriage, said it was a flawed and mistaken decision on his part, fully embraced same-sex marriage as a civil right, and was overwhelmingly nominated for Attorney General, by the way, defeating Justin Fairfax.
But by the way, didn't I see that Northam himself voted for George W. Bush in 2000 and 2004?
Until Ralph Northam got involved in elective politics, he was a default Republican. And I am trying to avoid descending into into stereotypes, but there is not that image of the physician as a Republican. He
Reminds me of Senator Bill Frist.
Yeah. He grew up in a conservative but Democratic family. His father was a judge and prosecutor, and forebears were also involved in elective life on the Eastern Shore. The governor's father got his judgeship through his law partner, who was a state senator from the Eastern Shore and was defeated by Tommy Normant, who is the Republican majority leader in the Senate. I only mention this because it brings to mind something that Douglas Southall Freeman, the newspaper man, said, and this is Freeman, the man responsible for the Lost Cause School of Civil War history, that somehow the Civil War was this principal disagreement among noble men. But it was Freeman who said of Virginia, relations are more intimate here.
Jeff, while I have you, I have to ask you, this is your 40th year in Richmond?
It will be my 41st year.
41st year. And it's got to be germane to this conversation to the extent we're talking about kind of a baptism by fire here and a very difficult conversation about both direct and coded racism and privileged racism. What do you think when you drive down Monument Avenue and see these statues of Lee and Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart? And what do you think when you're on 95 and see that giant Confederate flag, an hour and a half north?
Well, let's put it this way. The reason those statues went up in the late 1800s and the early 1900s was because someone decided, and with a nudge of sorts from folks like Douglas Southall Freeman, that the story of the Civil War was going to be told differently. Those statues are bronze and marble examples of what today we call revisionist history.
Okay, but this isn't Epcot Center or Wally World. This is the capital of Virginia, a benchmark representative, very changing state. And yet these are things you're not supposed to touch among very genteel people who show up at the diner and bump into you and bump into me and talk to you about your column. And I wonder if we morph into more of a conversation about privilege, like, that has nothing to do with blackface. But then when I talk about this historically, it does.
Well, as I said, this is, I think, a form of revisionist history, and there is the argument that to take them down qualifies as yet another form of revisionist history. There is, and I think this really achieved full boil in the 50s as the struggle over civil rights really began to accelerate. These symbols of the South, these symbols of defiance, were essentially abducted, if you will, or seized by the wrong people. And this is why we see what we saw in Charlottesville.
Jeff, I posed this question to my rabbi when the monument imbroglio in Charlottesville happened and that awful 3 days. Is this tantamount here, what we have on Monument Avenue, to say a Jewish family living in Bonn or in Dresden or something like that and having to drive past statues of Nazi war heroes? Not necessarily genocidal captains of the concentration camp. But can you put yourself in those empathic shoes to say that if you look at the Devil's Half Acre and everything that happened in the Shako slave jails, that was effectively, the hardest thing for white Richmonders to seem to say is that this was a Holocaust for the African-American population. The things that transpired downtown were Holocaust-like. So we can't in this day and age afford to have Holocaust-like symbolism. Is that taking this a step too far?
I don't know that it's taking it a step too far, but all too often history is written by the wrong people. What was it that was said about history is written by the victors? In a place like Richmond, it's somewhat odd. The victors here were very much losers, and as a consequence, those who were ideally liberated by the Civil War, the enslaved, suddenly found themselves enslaved anew, because we saw this renewed rise of white power in a South that remained terrified of African Americans.
I tell people externally, a lot of people in New York seem to think I moved to Tuscaloosa or Talladega or Valdosta when I moved from New York to Richmond, but you're probably 20 times more likely to see a gay pride flag in this town than a Stars and Bars. You'll occasionally see these guys near the boulevard, near the Confederate Museum.
I think it depends on what parts of town you go to.
But you come to Richmond proper and then Henrico.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you venture into the counties, I'm from Hanover County, and certainly if you venture back far enough in there, you have no shortage of Confederate flags and other symbolism of a lost cause, and as you said, very much losers.
I think that
close us out, Jeff.
Well, I think that one of the things that people may not understand about Virginia as the northernmost southern state, that with all of these dramatic changes in its population and that diversity, that we're very much kind of the Mid-Atlantic now, and less so of the South. This is a sore point with a lot of folks. But I guess I would also say this is that Virginia historically has had a special tie with the North. This was the industrial center of the antebellum South, and this was a state that was the last to secede and it was hesitant to do so because it was not interested in cutting off sources of capital through Wall Street and the New York financial circles. So the alleged distaste for things northern around here, the record really doesn't bear it out.
154 years later, that tension persists. I cannot thank you enough, my guests. You were listening to Jeff Schapiro of the Richmond Times-Dispatch, Judi Crenshaw, professor at the VCU's Robertson School of Media Culture, and, of course, Samantha Willis of the Unmasking series. Thank you so much. It was a difficult conversation, but it's one we had to have.
Thank you, Robin.
Good to see you.
Thanks.
Full disclosure, our engineer is John Valentine. This show runs on WCVE News 88.9 FM, on NPR.org, and on the NPR One app. Of course, you can listen to us on iTunes at link fulldradio.com. Founded and recorded in the RVA. I'm Robin Farzad, back with you next week.